Hi everyone, it's Ms. Hartman again, and I'm here to talk to you about how to read a rubric. Now, rubrics serve multiple purposes. First, we provide rubrics to allow you to see what is expected of you in your writing, in your short answer response. It's also a tool that your teacher is going to use to give you a grade in your writing. This is how your teacher will be able to explain why you got the grade that you got. So your teacher will make comments based on the criteria in this rubric and grade you based on which category you fall into for each of these descriptors. So let's start. I'm using a lot of words that we haven't talked about yet. So let's start from the beginning. Each rubric is going to include instructions. This is your writing prompt. So the instructions here are to choose one of the following questions to answer in a complete paragraph. This outlines what is expected of you. What are you writing about? So how has a character grown or changed in your book of choice? Or how does the setting influence the plot in your book of choice? You can choose one of those to write about, whichever one you feel more confident in writing. Now, let's take a look over here at this column. These are our descriptors. So as you know from the videos in the past that you've watched, you're going to have three different parts in your answer or in your response. You're going to answer the question. That's the first part. You're going to have your text evidence statement. That's the second part. And then you're finally, in your third part, you're going to explain or analyze the text evidence and explain how it supports your answer. So those are the three parts that you will be graded on for this short answer response. Now up here, we have different points and different names for each point. So over here, it goes from exemplary with 10 points available to not applicable with 0 points available. Now I always start, when we look at rubrics, I always like to start by looking at proficient. Proficient is exactly where we want you to be. Proficient is exactly where you're supposed to be at this grade level at this time. So I'm going to read this very carefully. For my answer, I'm supposed to answer the prompt correctly. Okay, and then for my evidence, I need to correctly cite one piece of evidence from the text. So notice how this rubric is telling me exactly how many pieces of evidence I need to cite and how to cite them. I'm going to embed the evidence within a sentence using a sentence stem. I'm going to support the answer. The evidence supports the answer to the prompt. So I'm making sure I'm using evidence that actually supports my answer. And then finally, in the explanation and analysis, I'm going to look at this. I have explained how the evidence supports the answer. Okay? So if I do all of these, I have received proficient grading. That means I can get an 87 on this short answer response. Now, let's say you want to go above and beyond and you say, you know what, I'm not happy with that. I can do better than what's expected of me. Let's take a look over here at the exemplary. So let's look at the difference between an exemplary response and a proficient response. The difference here is that you are you're using strong diction and precise language. I'm going to highlight that because that's the difference. So not only am I answering the prompt correctly, I'm using strong diction, which are strong words, and precise language. I've gotten to the point. I didn't ramble, I just got straight to the point. Now let's look at evidence. The difference between exemplary and proficient here in evidence is that you have cited more than one piece of evidence. So you've cited 2 or more pieces of evidence. You have embedded the evidence within the sentence using minimal parts of a quote. So maybe you chose not to use an entire sentence. Maybe you pulled some words from the sentence to use for your evidence and you embedded that into your own sentence. That's what would get you exemplary rather than using one or multiple sentences from the text. And then finally, your strong evidence supports the answer to the prompt. So it is very strong. There's no question that this evidence supports your answer. Okay? And then finally, in the explanation, that the difference between exemplary and proficient is that clearly explains, so it's very clear how your evidence supports your answer. fully explaining their train of thought. So you're not rambling here, you're getting straight to the point, and you are explaining how you got there. You're explaining how that evidence supports your answer. And then here's the biggest difference. In your explanation, if you would like to get exemplary, you make a real-world connection. That could be from something you've seen in the news, that could be from your own personal life, something in your community. You're connecting what you explained in your explanation to the real world. Okay? Now, let's look at emerging. Emerging is almost to proficient, but not quite there. Maybe you need just a little bit more help to get to proficient, but you're on your way. Let's look at the difference between emerging and proficient. So here are the two biggest differences. That the answer is unclear, or, because notice that it's only one of the following errors, okay? Or, your answer doesn't connect to the prompt. You didn't really answer the question. Okay? Let's look at the evidence. So maybe you didn't cite the evidence properly. And in emerging, you're going to make 1 to 2 of these mistakes. So you won't make all 3 of these mistakes. You might make 1 to 2. So maybe you didn't cite the evidence properly. Maybe you didn't embed your evidence. Maybe you just kept your evidence as its own sentence. Remember, we don't want to have our evidence sitting all by itself, lonely and outside of a sentence. So we didn't embed it. Then, it didn't clearly relate to the answer. So notice here, evidence supports the answer to the prompt, doesn't clearly relate to the answer. Okay? So maybe you tried really hard, but your evidence doesn't really have anything to do with the way you answered the question. And then finally, your evidence doesn't clearly support the answer, and your analysis, you are rambling, and you can't really make that explanation because your evidence is not clear. Okay? And then finally, in novice, this is where you are going to need the most work. You may need to come in for your tutorials to have concept to attend a reteach, because you're just not quite getting it yet. And it's okay, but if you fall into this category, more than likely you may have to redo the assignment. If you fall into all 3 sections in this category. So let's take a look at this. The answer is unclear. Well, that's the same as emerging. Answer doesn't connect to the prompt. That's the same as emerging too. Here's the biggest difference. You've made both of these mistakes. Okay, remember in emerging, it was one or the other. Here you've made both mistakes. Same thing over here. They're the same. They have the same bullet points. But notice right here, you have made all 3 of these mistakes. And then finally, in this section right here, you haven't really explained how your evidence supports your answer. You just kind of summarized the evidence. You just told me what was happening in the story at that moment. And then you don't connect it back to the answer. So you pretty much just gave me a recap of everything you just told me. And finally, in not applicable, that means that you just didn't do it. You didn't answer the question. Or you didn't give me any text evidence at all, and you didn't explain the evidence. So typically when we see this not applicable, these are the responses that have been turned in that are only 1 sentence long. Remember, we're asking you to write a paragraph. So for you to get not applicable, you just didn't do the work, and you will have to redo the assignment. Now, to find out what grade you have gotten, so let's say we are going to try for all exemplary. If you get all exemplary, if you get an exemplary answer, an exemplary evidence, and explanation, you've earned 30 points because there are 3 categories and these are worth 10 points apiece. So that adds up to 30. But let's say you gave an exemplary answer, but your text evidence was over here at proficient. However, when you explained it, you had a stellar explanation and you get exemplary for that. That gives you a 28.7 and you still get an A for the assignment. So that's how we determine your grade in a piece of writing. We will use the rubric to explain your grade, and it helps us look for the things that we've asked you to write about.